I am really honored to have been invited to be here at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, and doubly so to be giving the Ramsey Lecture. Let me say a bit about why, for me, this is significant, both being here and really the namesake for this lecture. The last decade, really, for me, has been one of public service, and with the most concentrated beginnings of it in 2007, really not far from here at 500 North Calvert Street, as the financial crisis began to unfold for our state and for our country. I had an agreeable turn of memory when I drove up MLK Boulevard and into the parking lot. Pulling into the parking lot, I was brought back to an exceptional time a decade ago when I was contemplating what it would mean to leave what many might have viewed as the upward trajectory that my private sector financial and legal work had taken, and embark upon what would become a journey of heart and soul that would put me directly face to face in dealing with the damage being created by the financial crisis. I had agreed to become the Commissioner of Financial Regulation for the state of Maryland, to the dismay and puzzlement of many friends and family and colleagues. This had been completely my idea. Nobody had prompted me in the direction of state service during a tumultuous economic time. Nobody had said, this is a good use of my law degree and education. Nobody had pushed me out the door of my upwardly mobile traditional career in finance and law. It was 2007, and I was driving my car through the streets of Baltimore, noticing the rows and rows of for sale signs, wondering indeed whether this was how Baltimore always looked, somewhere perched in between complacency and anxiety, somewhere within the margins of the identity of a metropolis looking outward to the rest of the state, nation, and world, and the identity of a devastated, charmed city that looks inward to itself and its neighborhoods for its strength. But more immediately than daydreaming about how the financial crisis would alter Baltimore's core identity, I needed to find the parking lot at 500 North Calvert Street. I found it, and upon entering it, I saw the parking lot attendant across the alley with a packaged Twinkie from the grill across the alley. Now, to foreshadow a bit, this parking lot attendant would later, on several occasions, step out of his usual roles to help me fix flat tires on my car, which came with the territory of driving over potholes that dotted our roads, especially during periods of tight state funding. And every time this parking lot attendant would fix my tire, he'd be eating a Twinkie. This was a parking lot attendant who loved Twinkies. But let me offer a weightier example of this kind of experience. One now famous literary moment, Marcel Proust dips a Madeleine into his tea. The taste of the wafer brings back floods of memory, sufficient to liberate memories of a time that was lost to him, yet now was never lost at all. So, like Marcel Proust's dip of the proverbial Madeleine into the tea, pulling into the parking lot today at Paca and Green and seeing the attendant, not with a Twinkie, but something similarly packaged and creamy, which I hadn't even realized was food that was still eaten, but after all, this is Baltimore, was for me the liberation of memories of a time that was lost. But with the invitation of this lecture, I now reclaim. And in that reclamation, I need to recall another parking lot attendant story. A couple of weeks ago, I pulled into that same parking lot right there on Paca on my way to the law school's business law boot camp. Traffic on 95 was bad, and I was detoured and late before I even got to the parking garage. And then pulling into one of the few available spots left in the garage, I realized that my car's bumper extended over the yellow line that forms the basis for a $53 penalty. I didn't have much time to contemplate whether my Honda Accord would capture the attention of the parking garage's enforcement unit and move to another parking spot, only to discover that my wallet was missing and that I would be both late for the class and not have my driver's license, which was in my missing wallet, and therefore I would not get into the law school building. And so a debacle was in the making. A parking lot attendant noticed my decisional paralysis and asked me what was wrong. I explained. He said that if the wallet showed up, he would make sure it was put in the parking garage's lost and found. That struck me as outlandish and preposterous, especially given that my wallet contained a wad of cash and several enticing credit cards. As I was contemplating my options, waiting at the light at the intersection of Paca and Maryland, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Indeed, there behind me was the parking lot attendant. He is holding my wallet and asks me if this is the one. He has found it, many floors lower than where I ultimately parked, and defying all expectations of what normally is said to occur in parking garages when lost wallets are found. He is giving it back to me with all the contents intact. And here, right here, this emotion overtakes me of the bonds of trust and cohesion and commonality prevailing over the powers of conventional wisdom and behavioral assumptions. But I'm still not done with my parking lot stories. Driving into the parking lot here liberated still another memory. This one, a memory from that first day as Maryland's Commissioner of Financial Regulation back in August 27. I parked my car in the Calvert Street garage underneath the office, stepped out of it, found the elevator, looked for a directory that didn't exist, decided to stop at each floor and peek out to see if I had arrived, and stopping at the third floor, noticed a promising paper and handwritten sign taped onto the wall with an arrow. It said, "Commissioner this way," as if the commissioner's last name was this way. And I found my way to the front desk. The front desk had no one behind it. There was no one to greet me. And with my keen sense of appropriate office cleaning, I noticed that the rug showed signs of water damage. I walked into the empty office with the old metal desk, put down my briefcase, watched a tiny mouse scurry under the old metal desk, decided I needed to climb on top of the metal desk to get away from the mouse, and realized there atop the desk that my job had begun. It was time to address the financial crisis that was unfolding before our eyes. But being here today is another kind of reclaiming of old time. And that brings me to the namesake for this lecture, the Honorable Norman Ramsey, former United States District Court Judge, Deputy Attorney General for the state of Maryland, Assistant U.S. Attorney, partner at the Semsbo Law Firm, lecturer here at the University of Maryland Law School. And wanting to know a little bit more about the namesake of the lecture that I had been invited to give, I thought I would take 5 minutes and do a Google search to see what, if anything, had been written about Norman Ramsey. To my amazement, the research was rich and voluminous, and I learned that the namesake for this lecture was a lawyer who exemplified a devotion to the practice of law and justice. Indeed, Norm Ramsey was a Maryland lawyer of such distinction that after his death, an entire issue of the Maryland Law Journal was dedicated to including pieces about his career from his contemporaries and Maryland legal luminaries. I found reading these pieces to be extraordinary, and the experience of understanding him through the eyes of so many of his colleagues on the bench, from the Attorney General's office, from former governors, state senators, from private practice, from the law school, from colleagues on committees like the Baltimore Fire Board, the Baltimore Board of Ethics, the Library Committee of the Baltimore Bar Association, the Board of Trustees of the Public Defender System. This experience of reading these tributes to him was like the Proustian bite of the Madeleine, a reclamation of a lawyer's time, well-lived, well-experienced, variegated and diverse, containing hints of experiences that so many of us lawyers seek out and believe to make up the composition of a legal life worth living. And it's relevant to the topic of the Ramsey Lecture today to know what I took from reading these tributes in the Maryland Law Journal, namely that our system of laws and justice is only as good as the perspective of those who administer it. Judge Ramsey believed that the administration of justice matters as much as the laws themselves. And this devotion to the administration of justice marked his legal life. It's a devotion that is reflected in the nearly 100 different committees and involvements across the entire breadth of the legal system, city, state, and federal, in all its different manifestations: defense, prosecution, regulatory, judicial. When I read the list of Norm Ramsey's committee affiliations, it seemed beyond the capacity of a single individual, a single lawyer, to have participated in within one life, the one life that we're given. And while the list of legal accomplishments achieved by Norm Ramsey appears out of reach for many of us, what appears well within our grasp is the idea that our systems, be they legal, be they financial or market-based, are not designed to be self-executing. They require administration and human effort and judgment. And without this tending to, this attention to how they operate, they are flawed. They produce bad results, and they create disconnects with the societal impulses that created them in the first place. So, in the spirit of this notion that we humans are necessary ingredients in the administration of our systems, be they legal systems or market-based financial systems, this afternoon, I channel both the example of Judge Ramsey and the example of the parking lot attendants who return people's wallets, fix people's tires, and go way above and beyond what our legal-based and market-based systems can do on their own to talk about financial anxiety and why we care about it, and what the administrators of justice can teach the administrators of commerce, in other words, our economic policymakers, about how to create better conditions for prosperity. So I bring us back to the moment in 2007 when I'm escaping the mouse and contemplating what to do when I've become the Commissioner of Financial Regulation and I'm standing on my desk. And it's 2007. The macroeconomic data indicated stable employment, stable inflation, solid economic growth, home ownership on the rise, a strong clip to business investment. But underneath these positive indicators, the economic landscape looked different. There were predatory lending behaviors occurring. Many home mortgages were subprime, meaning that the monthly payments that many people were paying were dependent on interest rates staying low. Wages were flat. There were many homes for sale, and the owners of these homes were underwater, meaning that they owed more money to the bank than their houses were worth. Some extraordinary observers were noticing that there were more of those 1-800 signs on telephone poles, the kinds that read, "Foreclosure Rescue" and "We Buy Houses for Cash." The signals indicated financial anxiety were blinking yellow for those who thought to look. Indeed, the financial crisis was beginning and was unfolding. Now, there are different views as to exactly when it started, but within a compressed period of time, broker-dealers like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers had been sold in distress or liquidated. Home values had plunged, leading to wave upon wave of foreclosures in succession, each resulting in people not being able to sell their homes. Layoffs in nearly all sectors spiked. Banks were forced to take capital infusions from the Federal Reserve and Treasury. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored buyers of home mortgages, which provided liquidity to lenders providing financing for home purchases, had been put into conservatorship by the federal government. Prices started to decelerate, leading consumers to postpone their purchasing even more, which caused firms to lay off even more workers because demand was falling. Economic activity came to a virtual standstill, which is, after all, the definition of a recession. We were in a recession. Our recession here had exacerbated slow growth patterns or recessions in other countries, as firms in other countries found that they couldn't export their goods and services to the US because demand here was so low. It felt like dominoes, one breakdown causing another. This was what the financial crisis looked like, and it was longer and deeper than anyone had imagined. It was the worst downturn that our country had experienced since the Great Depression. Many of us had not experienced a downturn like this before. These were bad times in our own memories and in our own family histories. And to fast forward and skim over very important ways in which we restarted the economic engines and important ways in which both fiscal policymakers and monetary policymakers and regulators acted is not exactly fair. Diagnosing and restarting the economy was how I spent the last decade. These were the challenges of economic policymakers of the time. In many ways, we were engaged in attempting to stop the dominoes from falling and then attempting to stand them back up. We needed first to stand the economy back up, then minimize the chance that a crisis of such depth and magnitude could happen again, and then figure out ways to provide resilience in our economic policy-making institutions and our private financial firms and our households, so that if this were to happen again, it would not be as deep as it was, and it would not be as long as it was. And now, despite the fact that the darkest days of the financial crisis and resulting recession are behind us, there is not a sense of mission accomplished. There is not a sense that all has been corrected and improved, that jobs are secure, that our personal data and signifiers are secure, that the next generation will be better off than this one, that prosperity has reached into most cities and communities, that we've saved enough to comfortably retire, that the opportunities for mobility into a life of better quality still exist, that the paths of financial success are navigable. The pain and dislocation may not be manifesting themselves as they had during the financial crisis, as each so-called domino fell, but they're with us. Whether it's a fear of losing our jobs to automation, fear of not finding a job in the first place, fear of not being able to provide our children a quality higher education, fear that the next generation will not be better off than this one, fear that we can't retire, fear that our consumer data has left us vulnerable if we are to need credit, the fear is there for all to see. We may be living with fear, living in an age of financial anxiety. I'm going to talk about this financial anxiety, and in trying to define it, I'm going to refer to a related concept called economic insecurity. And I'm going to invoke the view of Judge Ramsey that the fair administration of our legal system is necessary for our societal well-being, and I'm going to use that concept to suggest that the fair administration of our financial and market-based systems is necessary for our economic well-being. I'll try to describe my sense that high amounts of financial anxiety are bad for both individuals who then become economically insecure, but also bad for prosperity in the macroeconomic sense and more broadly. Financial anxiety has the potential to slow economic growth, to reduce the lubricants that permit a strong economy, to eat away at the trust and confidence necessary for our financial system to operate, and that if we ignore it, we lose sight of how to prevent irreversible and costly erosions in our nation's prosperity. Or thought of another way, financial anxiety matters from a macroeconomic perspective because it keeps people from taking the risks they need to in order to take advantage of the opportunity to get an education or a better job or a chance to retire comfortably. When financial anxiety increases, we are afraid of participating. And large swaths of people also are afraid to participate, and if they do as well, the economy loses its potential and stagnates. Well, what is financial anxiety? So there's no specifically defined term for it, but there is this concept of economic insecurity that provides a good starting point. The political scientist Jacob Hacker defines economic insecurity by looking at two components. One component is that the economically insecure are those people whose available incomes decline by at least 25% from one year to the next, after adjusting for inflation. The second component is that the economically insecure lack an adequate financial safety network to deal with this one-year decline. So you can see from this definition that the concept is dynamic rather than static. It has to do with the lurch rather than where the lurch leads. It isn't a measure based on having a fixed level of income, the way income and wealth and poverty and inequality measures are based. Instead, economic insecurity has as its core the idea of volatility, the idea that it's the swing downward of 25% from one year to the next that creates the insecurity, and that once experienced, there's not an adequate safety network to ameliorate it. In this dynamic notion, the insecurity is not a function of where you've landed, but the sensation of having experienced the lurch or downward movement towards a lower income level. With this measure of economic insecurity, we can measure the economic security of American families. Indeed, based on available census data, the economic insecurity of American families is the highest it has been in the past 25 years. Certainly, the economy's slow recovery from the financial crisis contributed to this American experience, but economic insecurity was growing before the crisis, and it is projected to continue to grow. The ESI, which is the Economic Security Index, is the share of Americans who are counted as insecure by this standard. The ESI has increased over the past quarter century. Indeed, in the 1980s, well before the financial crisis, the risk of an American in his or her 40s spending 1 year below the poverty line with inadequate financial resources to deal with the decline was 13%. By the 1990s, this risk grew to 31%. Using this measure, Jacob Hacker has observed that virtually all demographic groups have experienced significant increases in insecurity over the past 25 years. Well, if economic insecurity has increased, significant questions arise as to its effects. For example, we know that our financial crisis was longer and deeper than any recession since the Great Depression. Was our economy's ability to bounce back hindered by the fact that there were such large numbers of economically insecure people? Another question is whether this economic insecurity is related to the greater income and wealth heterogeneities that we're experiencing in the US. Or in the vernacular, how exactly is economic insecurity related to income inequality? A third set of questions relates to whether there are levels in which economic insecurity gets so great that people stop trusting the financial system and its ability to help people save, borrow, and be financially included? These are all questions to explore. But more immediately, if these trends in greater levels of economic insecurity continue, more Americans will be at risk of being economically insecure in the years to come. They will stop investing in themselves and in their families, all to the detriment of inclusive, strong economic growth. One approach to such growing levels of economic insecurity would be a focus on policy measures designed to bring people out of such insecurity. In other words, policymakers could determine how to quickly reverse any downward lurch into an upward lurch, or change the trajectory in such a way so as to restore the household into a situation of security, away from insecurity. Alternatively, we can determine ways in which this trend can be reversed, can be slowed or halted, so that individuals do not arrive there at the outset. It's this latter possibility that brings us to my idea of financial anxiety, namely the idea that there are features embedded in the laws that define our financial system and the way our financial system is overseen that can be identified and that put people at risk of becoming economically insecure. And by focusing on and extracting particular features of our financial systems that are defined by law, and looking at these features from the prism of what our laws and the administration of our laws are doing to people's financial anxiety, we bring attention to determinants that weigh heavily on the probability scales for experiencing a 25% drop in income in a single year and not having the financial ability to deal with this drop. And then we can alter these legal features appropriately. In other words, being able to focus economic policy-making attention on the features of our financial system that through law and the administration of law put a household or individual at risk of a lurch could focus attention on making sure that lurch doesn't happen, or alternatively, that it's short-lived. There may be a way to enhance the resilience of the individual or household so as to limit the effect of the plunge. The effort can be focused on the individual or on the means of support, whether they be in the form of compensation, like unemployment insurance, or in the form of Social Security, or in the design of the administration of our legal system, such as our bankruptcy laws and our foreclosure laws and our rules regarding housing finance and student loan finance. I call this financial anxiety because we often have no choice. We are financially fearful because of events that can happen through no fault of our own. We can experience a 25% downward lurch in income and not have the means to mitigate it, and nothing we could have planned or chosen could have stopped this. We will have had no personal agency in this process. Now, the economics literature is filled with metrics and studies of uncertainty. In other words, uncertainty is a concept that is measured and taken into account statistically and econometrically. Financial anxiety, though, is something different from mere uncertainty. After all, uncertainty implies some notion of choice. I'm uncertain about whether to turn right or to go straight, to choose the eggs Benedict or the omelet, to buy a house or rent, to lease a car or take a bike. See, that is uncertainty. I have a choice. I have options, but I'm uncertain about which option to take. With anxiety, there are no options, or the options come too late. That's the reason for the anxiety. There's a sense of exogenous factors outside the control of any of us that are going to move us in directions that we haven't thought through and that will lead us to experience potential financial losses that could be extreme. The concept of uncertainty implies choice and the ability to prepare. The concept of anxiety does not. Now, this is not to suggest that a lack of choice invariably produces anxiety, but are there some ways in which the lack of choice puts us at heightened risk for a drop in income that is unmitigated? Consider the following in the realm of technology. Technology has brought us many benefits in terms of the cost and ease of communicating, of conducting transactions, of operating businesses, of supply chain advancement, of creating more predictive models for risk scenarios, of creating speed and efficiency in the conduct of daily life. Technological development has been driven by the internet. Indeed, the internet has become the platform for engaging in activities like depositing paychecks, applying for a mortgage, splitting bills at a restaurant, investing in the stock market, and checking on our credit scores. But the internet is only an accidental enabler of these new activities. It wasn't built with these purposes in mind. It was built to be adaptable and to allow communication despite outages. It was also built to be decentralized and cost-effective. But it wasn't built to be secure, and it wasn't built to create automation of human functions. When it was conceived, it wasn't contemplated that the internet would serve as a backbone for all economic and societal activity. As a result, in our virtual financial lives, we have more options than ever to be connected, to conduct our commercial and financial transactions more cheaply, more quickly, and more conveniently. But we can also be less secure and can fear a society of automation. There's nothing that brings home this point more profoundly than the recent cyber attack at Equifax, one of the 3 credit reporting agencies that sizes up and scores us using algorithms that determine how much we must pay for the most expensive things we buy. This massive cyber attack resulted in more than half of adult Americans' credit data being hacked and appropriated by cyber criminals. A recent headline on September 23rd declares, quote, "Feeling stuck and helpless after the Equifax breach." In this piece, Ron Lieber of the New York Times describes the messages from Americans flooding his email after Equifax indicated that Americans had had their economic data hacked. He hears in the messages he receives a sense of helplessness, the recognition that we are at the mercy of an industry that makes money off our data, treats us with disdain, and answers to no one. Lieber sums up the thousands of emails he received over this cyber attack by describing the resentment that people feel over being trapped in Equifax's vast web of data with no recourse and no ability to opt out. He describes the expressions of pure raw fear about losing money and reputation, particularly for people who had to endure a long, hard slog to get and maintain good credit. The credit reporting industry exists to take numbers that define us, like our payment histories, run them through algorithms, and then spit out report cards and scores for each of us. These become final, generally unappealable judgments that dictate the interest rates that we pay on mortgages, car loans, and anything else that requires borrowing. If you want to do business with just about any financial services company, you must agree to allow it to report your payment history to the credit reporting agencies. This is reasonable in theory. An accurate central repository of data ought to make getting credit easier and cheaper. But there doesn't appear to be any way to step out of this part of our financial system unless you can live a life completely free of the need for credit, mobile phones, and many jobs, since employers often make a credit check a condition of employment. To be defined by this data, but to have no control over it and how it is protected or used, and to have little recourse in taking steps after the fact to change the consequences could be a source of significant anxiety. However, the extent to which it leads to economic insecurity, in other words, a sudden drop in income for which there's no financial means of dealing with the drop, hasn't been explored or understood. While I heard of no cases in which the day after the Equifax breach was announced, there was anyone who experienced a sudden loss of income, we can predict that the stolen Equifax data will eventually be monetized and used to construct false identities, which could lead to people experiencing significant difficulties receiving mainstream credit. Should events like this breach precipitate people needing credit and turning to lenders who don't use credit scores, the results could be massive and mind-numbing confusion, as well as credit on less affordable, less sustainable, and less reliable terms. The ability of people to rebound quickly from the effects to them of this breach could be diminished. Related to technology and the possibility that we are being hurt by it without having any choice in the matter is something called automation anxiety. Automation anxiety is the idea that we're going to lose our jobs and be replaced by robots. Or if not robots, some kind of algorithms that will render us as human beings worthless from the perspective of drawing an income. Could trends in automation provoke financial anxiety and keep people from being able to thrive in the economy? The theory here is that productivity, the engine to economic growth, will become driven by changes in technology. Indeed, some studies go as far as predicting that by 2022, 47% of jobs in the US could be automated away because greater productivity gains are to be had from technology rather than from people. Now, I happen to think that at the same time many jobs will indeed be automated away, there are several other jobs that will be added. The skill sets required in these new jobs will depend on educational experiences that impart a particular type of skills. And matching these skill sets to the people who otherwise would be displaced by automation will be a significant policy challenge. My own sense is that, like the Equifax breach, which has effects that will seep out over time, decades perhaps, the effect of automation on jobs will also not happen in one single blow, but will emerge wave-like and sequentially. And yet, regardless of how it emerges, the idea that huge swaths of our population could be ill-prepared for the displacement that comes from a skills mismatch is one that could signal more people experiencing significant drops in their income levels and economic insecurity, thereby increasing at a faster clip. There are professors here at the law school. Professor Gifford, Professor Pasquale are here today who are exploring the effects of automation and technology quite analytically, and their experience, expertise, and thinking in these areas are contributing to our understanding of what is at stake. But let's look at another potential source of financial anxiety as a precursor to economic insecurity. Student loan debt. During my time as Deputy Treasury Secretary, I visited colleges and universities and gathered roundtables of students who had used federal or private student loans to finance their education. Part of the reason I did this was to understand more precisely the reasons for the growing levels of student loan delinquencies and defaults. Indeed, when I started at Treasury, I gave a speech at UMBC and noted at that time that the level of student loan debt outstanding, and this was in 2014, was around $1.4 trillion. This was a high level of debt, and it was of concern because it was accompanied by higher levels of delinquencies and defaults on student loans than we had seen before. These delinquency and default rates represented late payments or no payments at all, and they could be significant from the perspective of being predictive of a life of economic insecurity. Is it the case that delinquency and default rates on student loan debt is a reflection of a student loan borrower's ability or inability to pay? If so, I would assert that these levels could be predictive of greater levels of economic insecurity. Well, as it turns out, the picture is more complicated. When We talked to different students at different stages of their educational attainment and at schools with different types of support systems. We noticed that confusion was high and that this level of confusion was contributing to students not knowing what options they had that were available for repayment, which ultimately could be contributing to higher than necessary delinquency and default rates. So it may not totally and completely be an inability to pay that is causing higher rates of non-payment, but also downright confusion about how to pay, whom to pay, and how much to pay. In conversations with students, in addition to observing fairly widespread confusion about how repayment works, there was also a sense that a big financial decision was being made about what school to go to, without a lot of information as to whether the debt required to support that choice would be something that the student's future income would be able to pay off. Or more simply stated, large amounts of debt were being incurred without a good sense as to how and whether the schools that were receiving the benefit of the loans would be contributing to an understanding of the type of job that the particular student loan borrower could expect with his or her degree. As we know, there are schools that mislead students about their job prospects. But even those schools that don't mislead students do a better or worse job helping students determine whether they will be able to pay off the debt they've incurred. This is all to say that there's a student loan debt system, and understanding how it works and how it could work better provides clues as to whether it's a source of financial anxiety. And again, the picture isn't entirely clear because we still see in the economic data, despite higher levels of outstanding student loans, higher income levels associated with graduates of quality institutions of higher education as compared to income levels associated with graduates of high schools. So by this economic indicator, at least, it appears as if going to a quality college or university is better than not. And yet, while incomes are higher for such graduates, we also hear about so-called crowding out effects, which are like indicators that students with higher levels of debt aren't buying homes, aren't starting new businesses, aren't consuming the way one would expect, resulting in potential reductions in economic growth and well-being. In short, the macro picture is murky. The available data shows that investment in completing a quality four-year education is still a sound one, and to date, the data shows that the upward push into higher income levels associated with a completed degree outweighs other effects that may represent a downward push into a lower level of income and greater economic insecurity. And yet, back to our roundtable discussions, conversations with students, there is confusion and there is a tendency to drop out of school with debt because of the financial need to work instead. I met students at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston who were first-generation college students, single parents taking the bus first thing in the morning to get their children to daycare, balancing schoolwork with the unpredictable schedules of part-time work. These students have to work extremely hard to make ends meet and simultaneously make the investment they need to be more economically stable. These students are student loan borrowers, but they also have significant educational-related costs like housing, transportation, food, and childcare that pose obstacles to their ability to stay in school. With financial pressures like these, it's not uncommon for a student to take between 3 and 6 years to graduate from a 2-year associate degree program. How is this not a type of financial anxiety? It screeches anxiety, and yet I would argue that with the right support systems, both within how we administer our student loan system in this country and how colleges and universities support their students' financial decision-making, we should be capable of preserving the human investment that a college education represents, while at the same time keep those from pursuing it from becoming economically insecure and abandoning the investment in their potential prematurely. In short, economic prosperity is linked to the ability of our policymakers to understand the sources of financial anxiety. Over the past generation, the economic risks that American families face have increased substantially. These risks are intensifying as public programs have failed to adapt. We often assume that the United States does little to provide economic security compared with other democracies. I'm not sure that this is entirely true. The US does spend less on government benefits as a share of its economy, but it also relies a lot on private workplace benefits, such as health care and retirement pensions. Indeed, when you include these private benefits into the mix, the US framework of economic security is not really smaller than the average system in other democracies, and it in fact is actually a bit larger. Social Security is declining, and perhaps that wouldn't be a bad thing alone if guaranteed private pensions were not evaporating at the same time. But firms are racing away from the promise of guaranteed retirement benefits. In 1985, 62% of medium and large firms offered traditional defined benefit plans, pensions that provided a fixed benefit for life. Today, the share is less than 20%. And as the nature of working for a single firm changes, access to these firm-provided benefits and commitments fades. As a result of this erosion in terms of retirement security, individual risk-taking in terms of personal investment, which has historically been the secret sauce that made economic prosperity something that permitted people to be financially included in the prosperity of our country. That needs to be addressed closely by policymakers. And while I call it a secret sauce, there's nothing really so secret about it at all. It's in plain view, ready for the tasting. It's mixed into our legal system and the ways in which our legal system is administered, particularly in the system of laws that govern our financial systems, our systems regarding jobs, our systems regarding our homes, our systems regarding our retirement security, our systems regarding our financial data, our systems of getting credit when we need it, our systems of getting a clean financial slate from bankruptcy. These systems are informed by law, and how they work to advance or hinder risk-taking among Americans needs to be an area of primary focus for policymakers who care about broad-based economic growth that is characterized by prosperity that reaches into every corner, urban and rural, coastal and interior, north and south. And now for the commercial part of this talk. For the students in this room, the lawyers-to-be, if you are curious as to how you can make a difference in making these financial systems work better for people, you can take my spring seminar, Law and Financial Anxiety, and join me in exploring something new, the question of whether financial anxiety matters and how our system of laws is structured to either enhance or ameliorate this anxiety. We will take a bite of the Twinkie and see what we learn. For the rest of us, let us ask our policymakers what they are doing to ensure that Americans feel secure enough to take the risks necessary for them and their families to take advantage of opportunity. Corporations enjoy limited liability, after all, precisely to encourage risk-taking. Can we tear a page out of the limited liability playbook to avoid the full liability that we now seem to be imposing on the economic well-being of American families? Why is it not the case that we are most capable of fully participating in our economy and our society, and most capable of taking risks and looking toward our future when we have a basic foundation of financial security and the appropriate safety networks in place? We are all on journeys of one sort or another. One of mine started right in this state, with a front row seat to understanding the economic devastation wrought on Maryland families from the financial crisis. And despite the fact that I had a steep rise into two of the most extraordinary positions in our nation's policymaking realm, it is here where I wanted to come to replenish my view of the economic and financial experience of most Americans. I come here to the Carey School of Law at the University of Maryland in Baltimore to take a bite of the proverbial Twinkie and share in the experience of what it means to be a human being at work in a parking garage, to have a job in a place of imminent automation, creeping algorithms and robots, a place of technological advance and technological intrusion, a place of vast opportunities to be educated, but at great cost, a place that involves humans looking after and caring for other humans, a human pumping up the tires of the car of another so they can drive home, a human finding another at a stoplight when they lose their wallets. Thank you for letting me return to give me a vantage point that becomes the basis for rigorously engaging in the collective process of softening the hard edges of financial anxiety and economic insecurity, of identifying and monitoring and deploying and administering the system of law and its institutional creations for the pursuit of creating the conditions for optimal and inclusive economic well-being, of pulling together all the perspectives we have at our disposal to learn the meaning of collective economic and financial prosperity. Thank you.